Good morning. I'm reaching back here quite a ways, and Bill and Sam and I are probably the only ones who remember this, but back in 1999, that's just a little ways back. In fact, I don't want to, I'm trying to think here, was everybody born back then? Yeah, maybe. There was a movie, Jim Carrey's Liar, Liar. I'm not a big Jim Carrey fan. In fact, I haven't seen very many of his movies, but this movie presented this kind of really interesting dilemma. What would it be like if you could never lie? And for Jim Carrey's character, he was a lawyer, and that became a real big problem. That was almost a career-ending problem for him. And so there's this classic scene in the movie where he's in court, and actually it's been a while since I've seen it. I can't remember who exactly who's on the witness stand. But he's trying to, I think, get them off. I believe he's defending them. And he can't, if they're about to tell a lie, he'll blurt out the truth. He can't not lie. He can't not tell the truth. Because he was a kind of a perennial liar. I mean, that was his habit. And so I think his son put the curse on him, and he has to tell the truth.
It was a birthday wish.
It was a birthday wish. Okay, that was it. And so he's in court, and he's trying to, in this particular scene, you can see him, he's trying to make his mouth not do what he's about to do, which is tell the truth, and he's not supposed to tell the truth. So anyway, this morning in our series, we're on to myth number 4, and that's this idea that the truth doesn't matter. Now, what's interesting about this particular myth is that most people would claim that it's better to tell the truth, and that kind of old cliche that honesty is the best policy still makes its rounds, and people, oh yeah, that's true. And although most people know they shouldn't lie, and there's probably very few of us that would advocate developing the skill of lying, that we hone our skill in that way. Nevertheless, lying is quite prevalent in our society today, and the truth has become this kind of slippery thing that sometimes is hard to find. But holding on to the truth is more than just about lying. Sometimes it's about making sure that we have good reasons for the things that we believe in. Sometimes we participate in other people's lives by just accepting their truth, which isn't true. So this morning, I kind of want to walk through this issue, and I've got a little problem. I don't want us to simply walk away with this kind of moralistic message that lying is wrong. But I kind of want us to, number one, be conscious of how prevalent it is, perhaps even in our own lives, and to ask the question, well, why should we be concerned about that? What's wrong with it? And make sure that we have good reasons for the things we believe, and to recognize that we don't want to be part of lying, and we don't want to be part of believing somebody else's lie and participating in that as well. So let's begin with the prevalence of lying. Let's just talk about that a little bit. There was a University of Massachusetts psychologist, Robert Feldman, who said, he did a study on this whole thing, and he said this, quote, most people lie in everyday conversations when they're trying to appear likable or competent. So think about your own life. His study found that 60% of people lied at least once in a 10-minute conversation. 10 minutes, and they had most people. In fact, the average was 2.9 lies per 10-minute period. 2.9. So, I don't know what a 0.9 lie looks like, but, So this only reinforces what the non-psychological perspective illustrated by Mark Twain 100 years earlier said. Here's what Mark Twain said. Quote, everybody lies every day, every hour, awake, asleep, in his dreams, in his joy, in his mourning. If he keeps his tongue still, his feet, his eyes, his attitude will convey deception. That was Mark Twain's very positive attitude on life and people in general. And so, you think about it, from the sports hero who denies using a banned substance to a politician who will promise you anything you want to hear with no intention, of course, of delivering. Lying is just quite prevalent. And it can take many different forms that we're familiar with. Of course, when we talk about lying is this deviation from what we believe to be true. It's typically happens when we know something else is true. Sometimes, however, lies begin when we deliberately present something that is false, but also perhaps when we believe that we've convinced ourselves that it's true, even though we have no good reason to believe it. So So some lies, of course, are small and innocuous. We call these the little white lies. These are the ones that we utter for kind of just to be polite. And so you have that classic, oh, yeah, that dress does look good on you, right? So these are justified oftentimes because we're trying to spare somebody's feelings. We don't want them to feel bad about themselves or about their performance or whatever it might be. But according to Virginia Woolf, the pursuit of truth without consideration for other feelings is an outrage to human decency. That we don't want to just tell them, no, you really look horrible today. No, we don't do that. Now, of course, men are perhaps very aware of this dilemma when perhaps their wife or their girlfriend would say, does this dress make me look fat? And Jeff Foxworthy has said, classically, that no good ever comes after those words are uttered. Okay, just don't ever ask that question. We don't want to know that. And some of these lies will come back and haunt you. So as a young husband, for example, if you're trying to spare your young bride's feelings by saying, no, that meal was delicious, you might end up eating that on a weekly basis from that point on, unless you share the truth that, no, I hated that. That was horrible. So sometimes, you got to just cut through and tell them, even though it's going to hurt their feelings. So we have those kinds of lies. But then there's the I didn't do it lie, right? That's the one where we try and shift blame. And this is actually one of the most common forms of lying, where we're trying to evade responsibility. We don't want to be in trouble for certain things, so we shift it onto somebody else. And I don't know why this memory sticks out to me, but I went all the way back to my childhood, and I had this toy castle. Actually, it was two castles I'd kind of put together. But I had this toy castle that I broke, and I was kind of heartbroken over that. And I then kind of put it back together a little bit. And then my sister came along, and she started playing with it, and it broke in front of her. And I was like, how could you do that? And then I started blaming my sister for breaking my toy castle, thinking that my parents would have pity on me and then buy me a new one. Of course, I'd done it myself, but it wasn't my fault. So that's kind of what we do. But as adults, of course, we do this. I'm sorry. I repent, Lord. I don't know that I've ever repented over that one. I repent. But the stakes get even higher, of course, as we become adults. And if we did something wrong at work or perhaps in a relationship, we don't really want to fess up to that, especially if the cost is high for telling the truth. And the higher the cost, the more there is pressure to evade. What if I tell the truth and I get fired? Or what if I tell the truth and that person leaves me? And so the I didn't do it kind of defense becomes something that we just is a fallback for us. And in extreme cases, it takes even a form of self-denial where we convince ourselves that I'm not responsible because I can't be that kind of person, right? I wouldn't be the kind of person that actually does that kind of thing, so we try and deny it even to ourselves. And then there's what we call exaggerations of the truth. This is I was almost a professional golfer, even though I've never played golf before. But this is the lie that's often tied into our self-image, where we want others to think well of us. We want them to be impressed by us. We want them to kind of respect us and admire us. So we will at times exaggerate our accomplishments and our own achievements. And these types of lies, of course, at times could have perhaps maybe even a moral, a kernel of truth in them, a little morsel of truth, but we blow it out of proportion. So maybe I was fairly good at golf, and that becomes, I almost was a professional golfer. So there's a temptation here to take our own achievements and make them better than they were. And sometimes, especially as you get older, there's this natural tendency, the farther it is in the past, then you kind of think of it maybe even to yourself as if it was grander. So you start lying to yourself. So when you're telling it to somebody else, it's really not a lie anymore because you really believe it. But you lied to yourself first thinking, yeah, I was pretty good at that. I was almost a professional golfer. Brad Paisley had a hit a number of years ago. I don't remember if you this one. It was I'm So Much Cooler Online. And this is kind of, if you ever saw the video, it was hilarious, where you had this 5'3" overweight pizza delivery guy who gets online and he becomes this 6'5" black belt in karate who drives a Maserati. And he's just really cool because he'd invented this image of himself. And I think I mentioned this last week, but the internet has become this place, especially places like Facebook, where we can exaggerate things and we can create a false image. We can create the image of who we really want to be and present it to other people of course, again, with that kernel of truth, yeah, I did that, but that's, then I build it up as if that's really who I am. And so there's these ways in which, we forget what we're really all about. And the problem is this lack of concern for the truth is embedded in our society in so many different ways. So think of, for example, the advertising industry. Think about products who make these outrageous claims to either stop aging or to get rid of your wrinkles or to regrow your hair or to help you lose weight without any effort at all. And people, are believing these things because they want to. I mean, it's preying upon people's hopes and fears. It's like they know in the back of their mind that probably doesn't work, but maybe there's a chance that it could work, and so they'll go ahead and do it anyway. And so the problem with that is that we get used to that, and we get used to distrusting people, that false claims can lead the public to be unsure of what to believe. Who can we believe? Who can we trust? And then perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this is what has recently happened, of course, in our own presidential campaign, the new term, the fake news, where evidently there were a number of stories that began to circulate online with no basis in fact whatsoever, and people would choose to believe them simply because they agreed with what they thought and what they wanted to believe, and they didn't care whether there was any truth in it or not, and that was really, really disturbing. But then another shift in that was where you now have people throwing around the moniker fake news for any story they just don't like. Oh, that's fake news because I don't like it or it's unhelpful to me or whatever. And I'm thinking, wow, when you get into a society where we can't trust anybody, then that becomes really, how do you know who to believe or what to believe? It really puts a damper on not only relationships, but in terms of how we can move forward as people working together. So that's really disturbing. So we need to make sure that truth still has some meaning, that truth has a connection to reality. And this has been a problem in the area of religion for quite some time, where people would just kind of invent their own system, their own hodgepodge of religious beliefs, and they'd say, well, that's my faith. Well, why? What base? It's just what I want to believe. I want to believe that's true. Well, what basis in reality is there? Is there any connection between what you believe and what is actually true? So truth has become this really slippery thing these days. And why is it that people like lies rather than the truth? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Of course, some of it's just purely out of fear of the consequences. So think about as a child, children don't tell the truth oftentimes because they don't want to be punished. So as a parent, you're in this dilemma. If you ask your child, well, tell me the truth, and they tell you the truth, and then you punish them, and then they figure out another time when they didn't tell you the truth and they lied, you don't punish them, guess what they're going to learn to do? They're going to learn to lie. Because you've taught them that. It's like, wait a minute, if I tell the truth, I get punished. If I lie, I don't have any punishment. I think a lie. And so that's a problem. And so even we remember this lesson as adults. And so we remember that we oftentimes, when we tell the truth, sometimes there's consequences for our actions. But if we lie, we can get out of those consequences. And so we have this kind of cost-benefit analysis as we're moving forward in our lives, trying to say, well, if the consequence isn't that great, I'll go ahead and tell the truth. But what if it's a significant consequence? What if my job's at stake? And maybe it's on your taxes. You figure, well, if I fudge this, I'll only be saving $50. That's not a big deal. But if I fudge this, I'll save $1,000. Ooh, then it gets a little serious. And then you're like, there's a pressure there because of the consequences. But what's interesting to me, I would find my kids sometimes lying to me, even when there didn't seem to be much at stake. It just seemed like the default response. I'd ask them, well, did you do something? He'd say, yeah, I did that. And then I'd find out afterward they hadn't. And it was like, why did they lie to me? Well, it was because it was just easier for them to say I had than to hear me say, well, now go do that. Or to hear just a brief little, sermonette from me about why didn't you do that. And they're like, it's just easier. I'll just say I did it. And you don't want that to be people's default response, where they learn that, lying can get me out of a lot of stuff. It makes my life a whole lot easier. That we need to recognize that truth is important. Well, let's go to Scripture and again, just look at some things. You don't have to look far to see that lying and truth-telling is pretty significant here. So the 9th commandment, of course, Exodus 20, verse 16, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Now, this is really interesting because here you are before DNA, before any of the CSI spinoffs, I guess I should say. They're simply witnesses. That's what you had. You didn't have forensic evidence. You had people that would testify. And so it became really important. Lies could really impact somebody's life because the consequences in the Old Testament for some of those offenses was pretty significant, even death. And so if you were giving false testimony against somebody, you could really get them into a lot of trouble. So that's why it was important for you to tell the truth in court. And so God was pretty serious about that. Even in our own court system, of course, telling the truth is stressed. And so you have people taking an oath before they testify. Now, what's interesting about that is the very fact that we have to make people take an oath. So, before now you can lie, but now at this point, you got to stop lying because we know people, right? And so, tell me, are you going to tell the truth or not, right? You can swear to that. So that's really interesting. All right, now look at Leviticus 19, verses 11 through 13. Do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. And so what we have here in Leviticus 19 is a series of instructions that deal with community and community life. And lying is at the very center of that, right? That recognizing how lies can break down community. Or look at Proverbs 12, verse 22. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in men who are truthful. So just a scattering of passages. Of course, there's quite a few others we could look at. But let's jump to the New Testament. Here's an interesting one in Matthew, chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount. Again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. You see, what's interesting about this is Jesus is referring to these various kinds of oaths, that there were different kinds of oaths that you could make to manipulate the truth. And it seemed like people were trying to use different degrees of oaths to trick the system. In fact, look at Matthew 23, verse 16. Woe to you, blind guides, you say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. I mean, here's an example of the religious leaders playing fast and loose with the truth. My oath only counts if I swear by something that's really valuable and truly binding. Otherwise, I can lie. Like, really? That seems ludicrous. So you remember in John 14:6 that Jesus describes himself as the way, the truth, and the life. And I don't think it's too much to suggest that those who profess to follow him would also be known as people of the truth. And so there is this really strong element in Scripture that we are to be people who stand by what is true and to be people who say what we mean and can be related to that. Now, that brings the question up, are there any times when lying is justified? And the rabbis had an interesting discussion about this. In fact, Rabbi Samuel Stahl describes the dilemma from a Jewish perspective, even a dilemma today. He says, quote, in the case of a seriously ill patient, our rabbis not only permit the white lie, they actually mandate it. Tradition orders us not to tell a person who is gravely ill about his or her condition. We should minimize the actual danger. So you don't tell them, yeah, you're about to die in maybe, 2 hours. It's probably not the best thing. Or this one was interesting where there was a debate. Another one. He talks about, in addition, when delivering the eulogy at a funeral, a rabbi should not necessarily present an accurate biography of the deceased. That's not the point where you're going to say, well, Sam was an okay guy. He had a few minor positive qualities, but let me tell you, here's the list of No, that's not the time to share that, right? Now, there's this other, the ancient conflict between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. So these are the two rabbinic schools from the time of Jesus, where they're in constant conflict over this particular question of the white lie. And so they debated this, what you should do at a wedding while you're dancing around the bride. So evidently there's this tradition, during the wedding you dance around the bride and you say certain things. And so the school of Hillel said, even if the bride is homely and unattractive, you should say she's beautiful and gracious. But the school of Shammai disagreed, and they said, no, you got to describe her how she is, because to do otherwise would violate the Torah. And I'm thinking, I'd just be quiet, but then that would proclaim another kind of message, would it not? If you're dancing around and you're saying nothing, I think she gets the point. So even, modern day philosophers can't agree on this specific one. Is there times where it would be okay? So you have the absolutists and the relativists. So some argue that lying is wrong no matter what the circumstances, and others contend, no, there are situations where it's appropriate to lie. And so the classic example of this is, for example, Corrie ten Boom and others who hid Jews from the Nazis. So if they come knocking on your door and the Nazis say, are there any Jews here? You say, well, yeah, I've got 6 stashed behind my wall and there's 3 others in the basement. No, that would be inappropriate. That there are occasions when lying is appropriate. That's the moral thing to do. That's the right thing to do. So at times, withholding the truth from others who don't really deserve it is the most merciful way to go. And indeed, we need to recognize that Scripture is not presenting us, this is a key point, with hard and fast rules. Because, sometimes there might be 2 commands in Scripture that if you take both of them literally, they might actually send you in opposite directions, depending on the circumstance. Instead, we need to understand why the truth matters. This isn't a moralistic message that says, lying is bad, don't do it. The question is why? I don't want us to leave this morning simply knowing that God doesn't like people lying, that He loves the truth. And I certainly don't want us to leave hearing that lying is on the list of God's things not to do. That's not what I'm after here. Yet as we grow and understand things in a deeper manner, as we become spiritual beings who ask deeper questions, it's important for us to understand the reasons that God asks us certain things. That there are reasons why God says, do these kinds of things, steer away from other things. That there is a reason why we're supposed to avoid lying and lead toward the truth. So rather than simply memorize a list of do's and don'ts, we must learn to see the world as God sees it and understand what's behind this. What are the problems? What are the dangers that are aroused when we don't have a concern for the truth? So I would suggest to you, there's lots of different reasons, but 2 today. Not holding to the truth incurs 2 significant costs for us. 1, it destroys trust. So communities, remember God's all about community. Communities are built on trust. So for example, I trust the engineer and builder of the bridge who says it's safe to cross. I do that every day. I trust the man at the utilities department who tells me the water is safe to drink. I didn't guarantee that. I trust the physician who gives me these pills and says ingest these 3 times a day, that they won't kill me. They'll actually help. I'm constantly trusting people. And individual relationships are certainly built on trust, right? There's a bond between parent and child, between friends, between siblings, between husband and wife that are built on trust, are built on this foundation that we are not lying to each other, because lies break down trust. And that was one of the messages, I had a hard time getting across to my son. I said, you might be avoiding a minor consequence here in the moment when you lie to me, but when I find that out, you have eroded trust. And the more that trust gets eroded, the longer it's going to take for me to trust you. You don't realize the hidden consequence when those lies are found out. That's why affairs are so devastating in a marriage. Affairs are interwoven with so many lies that when the truth is found out, the other spouse wonders, can I ever trust you again? How can I trust anything you say, because you've been lying to me all this time and I never saw it? the importance of trust in communities is so crucial to the New Testament community. Paul recognizes, look at Ephesians chapter 4. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitudes of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, notice the first thing, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, for we are all members of one body. See, the letter to the Ephesians has a strong message of unity built into it. It is really talking about how we, as this kind of divided community, can be one. And one of the quickest ways to break down trust in a community is to be spreading falsehood about each other. That at the very heart of community is this need to be able to trust, and truth is so important to that. So it's also important to recognize the importance to being a person of truth when it comes to evangelism. Right? So not only internally for us to be able to trust each other, but if you're trying to present Christ to the community, if people think of you as someone who is committed to the truth, when you begin to share the message of Christ with them, then they might start to consider it. And they say, well, Sam's always been an upright person to me before. I think, this stuff he's sharing with me has some merit. But if you're a person who plays fast and loose with the truth, that can impact your credibility. And you start trying to share this story of Jesus, and they're like, well, that's not a person that I really respect. Because they tell lies at work. I've seen them tell lies at work. I found them out. So it's really, really important in terms of this aspect of trust. Number 2, lying changes who we are. Each time we lie, and we do this for a lot of different sins, but each time we lie, we're breaking down our resistance to lying. That it becomes easier. The more you do anything, it becomes easier. And we lose part of ourselves. And we lose part of who we were intended to be when we give into these kinds of things. Lying changes our character. And it's, that's where the Jim Carrey story came in, because he had become a person to whom it was easy to lie. That was just part of his character. So much so that his son recognized it and expected it. That's just who you are. And it becomes easier for us to rationalize what we're doing. Oh, I'm just doing this because it's good for others. When in reality, it's often simply a selfish pursuit. When I was a kid, I used to read a lot of Westerns. I loved Louis L'Amour. My grandfather got me into Westerns. And in fact, I think I read like every book that Louis L'Amour wrote, except for the short stories because they were too short. But I read, actually most of his stories were really short anyway. And, so I read all that stuff as a kid, and it was really interesting because, of course, there was death and violence, but it was always done in the appropriate way. But he talked about the code of the West, which I'm sure is probably made up. But part of that code was that a man was as good as his word. And if you gave your word, you had to follow through. And there was whole storylines built around this fact that I gave my word. I can't go back on it. And it was when you read that today, it seems like such an antiquated thing. People it would boggle their minds. Well, I know you said that, but you don't have to follow through on that. You know that, really? But it was something where today we don't understand. We're part of this world of contracts where we got to sign papers. We have to have expert lawyers to put their stamp of approval on it to force people to do the right thing. And we got to always be wary of the loophole. They said that, but there's always this kind of, maybe there's some loophole I'm not seeing. People almost expect others to lie to them. Isn't that sad? And that shouldn't be what's characteristic of the church. Being a person of integrity is far more difficult when there are so many opportunities to fudge. When it's around you all the time. And there are 2 different definitions, interestingly enough, for this word integrity. We don't hear a lot of that word today, integrity. One meaning involves this idea of adherence to moral and ethical principles, soundness of moral character, honesty, that he's a person of integrity. But there's another meaning of integrity. The other meaning is a state of being whole, entire, or undiminished. A state of being whole, entire, or undiminished. So, for example, to preserve the integrity of the empire. We don't want the empire to break up. We want it to be whole. Now, we don't use that form of integrity very much anymore. But what's interesting to me is there's a connection between these two meanings. The person of integrity is whole and undiminished. But when we let the truth slip, when the truth no longer matters for us, we find ourselves diminished. We're no longer whole. We're no longer the people that God meant us to be. We're less than that. I'd invite the praise team to come up as we close. You know, Christ asks his followers to take up their cross and follow him, and we've looked at that a number of times. I would say part of following Jesus and taking up one's cross is being people of the truth, even when it's not convenient. Remember that as Christians, we're called to change the world, to be different than the world, and part of that means standing for the truth, even when others won't. Let us continue to worship him.